this video we're looking at the role of the father, which is a really interesting area of research and is actually a relatively new area. One thing that I just want to say before we get into the AO1 for this is that most of this research is typically focusing on Western middle class families and the Western middle class fathers. And so do keep this in mind. These findings generally don't apply cross-culturally. And it also presents a bit of a heteronormative bias as well, looking at traditional, inverted commas, families where there are two opposite sex parents. And so there's still a long way to go to be fully representative. So just know that in advance that this is typically representing middle class families from Western cultures and heteronormative nuclear families, if you will. Okay, so just a little bit of background before we get into the research. As we've discussed when we looked at the stages of attachment and research by Schaffer and Emerson, we know that traditionally fathers played a relatively minor role in infant development. Historically, they've been seen as the breadwinner, they've been seen as the earner who provides money to look after the family, and then typically mothers would stay at home providing childcare. And that would be our typical gender and parenting roles. But in the last 100 years, I would say even the last 50 or 60 years, the role of the father has actually changed significantly. And psychologists, for the first time, are really interested in exactly what the role of the father is. But as we'll look at when we look at the discussion in AO3 here, there is quite a lot of disagreement about the exact role of the father and wildly conflicting conclusions. So I just want to show you this data, this graph here. So this is research by The Economist looking at the amount of time fathers are spending with their infants each day between, say, 1960 and 2012. So some really, really interesting findings here. I believe the average number of minutes fathers spent with their infants in 1960 was sort of in the single digits. And nowadays we can see that it is well over an hour, about 2 hours with their infants in Britain. We can see that obviously there are massive differences when we look at different cultures. So Denmark, quite high actually. And France, some stereotypes there perhaps about involved parents, but when we look at the mother, there's also the mother spending less time with their infants there as well. We can also see differences between university educated and non-university educated. So this is likely to be due to income as well. So just some interesting findings there, just really highlighting here that fathers now are spending more and more time providing childcare. And so it is important to understand what the role of the father is. And if the father's role is different to the mother's, what effect is that having on the child's development? So, some questions on the role of the father. Just remember that most research up until this point has really focused on the role that mothers play in the child development. And the role of the father has typically been neglected. But now, more recently, we're looking at the specific role that a father can play. So some of the questions that we're asking is, do infants attach to fathers? That seems like a pretty big one. And if they do, when? Does this happen before they attach to mothers? Does this happen at the same time? Does this happen after? When do infants form attachment to fathers, if they indeed do at all? Why are fathers rarely the primary attachment figure? What is it about fathers that makes them less likely to be providing sensitive responsiveness to the infant? What is it? And are there special circumstances where the father can be the primary attachment figure? What exactly is the role of the father? Is it qualitatively different from that of the mother? Or can fathers take on a more maternal role if the situation arises? So what happens when the father is the primary caregiver? Do they take on that maternal role? Or do these differences and this distinct role of the father still exist? And then we need to think about the wider implications here. What are the implications for fathers? If the role of the father is similar to the mother, well, that has implications for childcare and parenting decisions and who stays home. This then has implications for mothers and the economy. So it's really important that we understand the role of the father and whether fathers can take on primary caregiving roles without harmful consequences for the development of their child. So these are the questions that we're going to be attempting to answer here, but as you'll see, there's a lot of conflicting evidence from the research. So let's start with attachment to fathers. Here we're really asking, do infants attach to their fathers and when? And as I've already looked at in the research by Schaffer and Emerson, fathers are much less likely to be the primary attachment figure. So in their research, remember that was in 1965, so perhaps now outdated, but in their research they found that 3%, only 3% of first attachments were to the father. And this is, of course, in comparison to the 65% of first attachments to the mothers. By the time we include joint attachments, that figure for mothers is around 95%. So significantly, infants are attaching to their mothers as a primary attachment figure, and fathers, not so much. However, we also know from this same research that fathers do go on to become important attachment figures. They often become the secondary or tertiary attachment figure. So by the time the child reaches this stage of multiple attachments, 75% of babies have formed an attachment with their father. And we know this because those infants show separation anxiety and stranger anxiety. And so we've got evidence there that fathers, although not the primary attachment figure, are important secondary attachment figures. So now we're going to ask the question, do fathers hold some specific value to attachment? Do they provide a unique role? And if so, what role does this play in the child's development? So this research by Grossman, more recent, more contemporary research here, and remember a longitudinal design. So we're following these infants from young infancy all the way through, in this case, to adolescence. And in Grossman's research, they found that babies' attachment to their mothers, but not to their fathers, was related to attachment in adolescence. So really, really interesting findings here. So in this research, it was longitudinal. Babies' attachments were studied from infancy all the way up until they were in their teens. And the researchers here looked at both parents' behaviour and its relationship to the quality of their baby's later attachments to other people. So they looked at interactions between the mother and the infant and the father and the infant, and then later on looked at that child's quality of attachments to other people in adolescence, like friendships and romantic relationships, for example. And here they found that the quality of a baby's attachment with mothers, but not to fathers, was related to attachments in adolescence. And this suggests that attachment to fathers is just less important than babies' attachments to their fathers, particularly when it comes to later relationships. So some interesting research there suggesting that the role of the fathers is less important than the role of the mother. But we do know that fathers have a really special role to play. They are typically seen as the playmate, and I know this seems a bit patronising, but it's important. So male caregivers make really unique contributions to early infant development. And this means that their role is qualitatively different, distinctly different from that of the mother. So they tend to take on the role of playmate rather than the provider of emotional support. So they encourage risk-taking, they engage infants in physical play and really enjoyable games, and they get them to take risks. They engage them in opportunities for play that they otherwise wouldn't be engaging in if it was just left to the mother. So father's play is typically seen as more exciting. Infants really like playing with the father because his play is more exciting in comparison to mothers. But when we look at a mother's interactions with their infants, they're seen as more nurturing and more affectionate. And what we see is that when children are in a positive mood state, when they're feeling happy, they go to the father. And when they're feeling in a low mood state, they typically want that comfort and that emotional support from the mother. But because of this, fathers are seen to make really important contributions to the child's cognitive development and language development as well. Because fathers' vocabulary is shown to influence language development. And this is only true for fathers and not mothers. So it seems that the wider and more diverse the vocabulary that the father uses, the greater effect this is going to have on the infant development. But it doesn't matter the extent of the mother's vocabulary for the child's linguistic development, which I think is really, really interesting. But we can't see this as meaning that the father's role is less significant. It is just as crucial for the child's cognitive and intellectual development here. But just one thing to note here, that this is really only observed with Western families. So, for example, in middle-class Indian families, the father doesn't take on this role of playmate. This does seem to be culturally and socially determined to an extent. So some really interesting findings here that father's vocabulary, but not mother's, influences language development, that father is seen as a playmate rather than emotional support, that infants go to the father when in a positive mood state, but the mother when they're in a lower mood state. But these findings, as I said, are not universal. All right, so now let's look at some interesting research looking at when the father is a primary attachment figure. So here we're talking about when the mother is perhaps not involved in the development of the child, perhaps the mother is working or ill or just simply not present. So we're looking at when fathers do take on the role of primary caregiver. It suggests that they are able to adopt the emotional role more typically associated with mothers, i.e. they're able to take on a maternal role in the absence of the mother. So in this research by Field, they were filming 4-month-old infants with primary caregiver mothers, primary caregiver fathers, and secondary caregiver fathers. So this is where the mother is present and is the primary caregiver, and the father is there as secondary attachment figure. Really interesting that in this research, primary caregiving fathers, just like mothers, spent more time smiling, holding, and interacting with their infants than secondary caregiver fathers. This is really, really interesting. Some other research, sort of along a similar nature, was looking at the level of interactional synchrony that fathers engage in with their infants. And they looked at mothers alone with the infant. They looked at fathers alone with the infant. And then they looked at mother and father together with the infant. And in each of these 3 conditions, they measured the amount of interactional synchrony that these parents were engaging in with their infant. Both mother and the father alone provided similar opportunities for interactional synchrony. So there was no gender differences there between the mother and the father. Both were able to provide interactional synchrony. Interestingly, mother's level of interactional synchrony didn't reduce when the father was present. She was still providing the same level of interactional synchrony as she would when she was alone. But when the father was engaging in interactional synchrony, but the mother was present, the father's levels reduced significantly. So it seems like when mother and father are alone, they produce similar levels. But the presence of both parents causes traditional parenting roles to appear. As soon as the mother is around, the father engages in a significantly less interactional synchrony. But when she isn't there, when it's just father and infant alone, he's producing similar levels of interactional synchrony to the mother. So I think that's really, really interesting. And this means that fathers can provide sensitive responsiveness required for close attachments, but typically only when taking on the role of primary caregiver or only in the absence of the mother. So perhaps this only expresses when the father is given the role of primary caregiver. So as we'll look at in the AO3, it really matters how we're studying the role of the father. Are we studying the role of the father as a primary attachment figure or a secondary attachment figure? Because the findings will differ.